These are two names you don't normally hear in the same sentence: Noam Chomsky and Piers Morgan. But this week, the two men were in conversation on Morgan's Talk TV show. They were discussing, among other things, relations between the US and Russia and China. And we'll jump into the chat just after Piers Morgan asked Chomsky what the Americans should do if China were to invade Taiwan.
The morally correct stance is to prevent it from happening. There is no indication that China is planning to invade Taiwan. If the United States increases the escalation, they might do it. In that case, the bars are down. You can't say, if you move on to war with China, we're basically all finished. But there's really no point considering a remote contingency when there are actual events taking place, like the U.S. escalation of the confrontation with China. China's not saintly by any means, nothing like it. But if you look at the facts, it's U.S. escalation. The U.S. is now trying to enlist Europe in its confrontation with China by expanding NATO. U.S. has expanded NATO to the Indo-Pacific region, turning it into an international military system under U.S. control. All of this is going on. We can, if we like, talk about the possible contingency of China invading Taiwan, for which there is no indication, though it could happen if we continue the provocation. Remember, the provocation is serious. It's both in the military dimension and in the commercial dimension. Quite openly, what I've been referring to is public policy, very open. And it is increasing the threat. You put nuclear-capable B-52s in flying distance to China with nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, that's provocation.
Chomsky made two claims there I didn't know about, so I had to Google. The first was about NATO expanding to the Indo-Pacific. This is a press release from NATO's own website in April this year. NATO and its partners in the Indo-Pacific have agreed to step up political dialogue and practical cooperation in several areas, including cyberspace, new technology, and countering disinformation. Because global challenges demand global solutions, they have also agreed to work more closely together in other areas, such as maritime security, climate change, and resilience. Now, maritime security, that means the Navy, doesn't it? So you can see why that might be seen as provocative. NATO had their first ever meeting, in fact, between NATO foreign ministers and foreign ministers from Indo-Pacific countries in 2020. So clear ramping up. The second point from Chomsky I didn't know about was the B-52s being stationed in flying distance of China. Chomsky, again, is correct. So in October last year, the US announced they would be funding an upgrade to an Australian airbase so that it could house 6 American B-52s, which are nuclear-capable airplanes. And let's see where the conversation went next.
They would argue, of course, that it's defensive, that these are protective measures. They're not provocative measures. They would argue that China's march to economic imperialism and their massive expansion of their military represents an existential threat if they misuse those powers. That's what they would argue. And therefore, what they're doing is protecting themselves and other countries from nefarious behavior by China.
I would suggest distinguishing between Western propaganda and the facts. So let's take China's military buildup. This is reported regularly by SIPRI, Swedish Peace Research Institute. You can pick it up on the internet. You will find that China's military expenditures for the past 10 years, per capita military expenditures, are a flat, straight line. They have not increased. Of course, China has increased its military as the population increases, but it's way below U.S. military expenditure. And the U.S. is far above in technological advances. So yes, and China, remember, is faced with security problems at every border. The United States is faced with no security problems, but U.S. military expenditures dwarf. They're about the same as the next 10 countries altogether. It's a per capita far beyond China. So yes, there is. And when we talk about this economic imperialism, exactly what are we referring to? We're referring to investment and development programs throughout Eurasia, expanding to Africa, expanding even to Latin America. The U.S. is trying to stop them, has found no way to do it, except by escalating in the military and economic dimensions, by trying openly, publicly, to try to prevent China's economic development.
If you don't mind me, at the risk of sounding impertinent, but you sound very trusting of China and its motivations.
No, not in the least. I said explicitly, China is by no means saintly. Plenty of criticisms you can make of China, but I would like to describe the world situation as it is, not as it's presented by U.S. British propaganda.
So there's one point there I think Chomsky didn't get quite right. So he said China's military spending has remained flat as a proportion of its population. And I think in fact, he should have said that China's military spending hasn't risen as a proportion of GDP. This is a graph from the St. Louis Federal Reserve using data from the SIPRI think tank, which Chomsky cited. As you can see, US military spending has been oscillating between around 3 and 5% of their GDP since the early 1990s. China has remained flat at around 2% of their GDP. So still a much lower proportion, but China's GDP has increased significantly in that time, so it will be more per person. In absolute terms, these are the world's top military spenders. So this is countries with the largest share of global military expenditure in 2020. So of all military expenditure in the world in 2020, 39% of it was spent by the United States. 13% of it was spent by China. Now, of course, China has about 3 times or 3 or 4 times as many people as the United States. And you can see they're spending a much lower proportion of global spending on the military. Then you've got India at 3.7%, Russia at 3.1%, UK at 3%, which is probably more than we need to be spending with a population like our own, down to South Korea at 2.3%.
Increasingly, we find that some of the most interesting conversations and the deeper analysis of what's going on, they just don't happen on legacy media, right? And I'm not some cheerleader of Talk TV. Piers Morgan often gets quite interesting characters to talk about with. Andrew Tate's interview with Piers Morgan, to me, was more instructive than the one I saw on the BBC, for instance. It was more instructive. I learned more. That doesn't really seem to be the basis of most of the sort of long-form interviews you see in the media, if at all, in mainstream media, legacy media. They tell you what to feel rather than what to think. I mean, telling anybody what to think is bad enough, but telling them what to feel is just daft. It's ridiculous. So yeah, it was interesting. And there are a few things I want to come back here on, Michael. The first is that NATO is looking at opening a liaison office in Japan. So that's substantially what I think what Chomsky was referring to. They want to open for the first time an office in East Asia, in Japan. The French oppose it, so it's highly controversial. It's so controversial that one of Europe's 2 nuclear powers opposes it. NATO was founded as an alliance to defend Europe in the case of Russian aggression after World War II. NATO has never fought a war in Europe. Isn't that remarkable? NATO has never fought a war in Europe. It is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I mean, Japan, if you look on a map, Michael, it's not particularly close to the Atlantic.
Just one second, just to clarify, wasn't NATO involved in Kosovo and the sort of Serbian?
I think if you look at the legalities of it and whatnot, I don't think that in terms of a dispute, I think it was more of a peacekeeping effort. In terms of a war, you're looking at 2, frankly, which were Libya, and they might even say Libya wasn't. It was just peaceful regime change. We were helping domestic forces, but the big one, of course, is Afghanistan.
Yeah,
is that is the big war against the sovereign entity, which is we don't want to be invaded. Kosovo is somewhat different, and of course, with peacekeeping operations, you're in a very strange place. But frankly, Michael, the big military operations of NATO in their history, quite recent, Afghanistan, Libya, neither are in Europe. Neither are anywhere near the Atlantic. So I can understand why the Chinese have significant misgivings around that. And then if we look at military bases worldwide, the US has around 750 military bases globally across around 70 countries. China has around 3 overseas foreign military bases. 3. maybe 5, 2 of which are unconfirmed in Asia. 3. One in Tajikistan, one in Djibouti, and I think one in Pakistan, which is a naval base which they barely use anyway. But clearly, it's a rising military power, and that number will probably go up. And it's important to say, like Chomsky, that nobody here is saying that China are angels. But if we're talking about military asymmetry, 750 military bases versus, let's say, between 3 and 5 for the Chinese. So I think this is a really, really important point, and I think he makes it very well. And on the issue of Taiwan, this is a very, very, very complex issue. First of all, Taiwan has the right to, sovereignty. It doesn't deserve to be invaded. I'm not saying it's part of Greater China or whatever, but the basis of the Taiwanese state is not comparable to something like Ukraine even. Nowhere near. Taiwan is an independent state from China because Chiang Kai-shek was the generalissimo. He was the head of state of China prior to the Communist Revolution. He and the Kuomintang, the preceding government of China, leave China because they're routed by the communists, and they go to Taiwan, and that's their base of operations. And they viewed it as really a continuity regime from what they previously had on the mainland. When they did that, they inflicted genocide, what was called the White Terror. Around 150,000 people went to prison. Thousands of people were murdered, including, by the way, independence activists who wanted an independent Taiwan from mainland China. So this idea that little Taiwan, they have such great democratic values, liberal democratic values, the history of Taiwan indicates something rather distinct. Now, Taiwan in 2023 is not the Taiwan of the 1940s or the 1950s, but before people start sort of trying to paint the Chinese as the bad guys and the Taiwanese and the United States as the good guys, things are a little bit more complicated than that. And it's not both sidesing. When I say that, I'm a journalist. It's my job to say that. It's my job to try and inform people and provide greater context, regardless of what idiots say on Twitter. Finally, Michael, the implications of a war between China and Taiwan, or a Chinese occupation of Taiwan, would be extraordinary. Taiwan presently produces 90% of the world's leading microprocessors, the leading chips in everything from phones to computers to the highest technology like robotics. It is generally fabricated by a company called TSMC, which is in Taiwan. Now, if there was a war and the fab labs that make those chips, those semiconductors, were destroyed or just simply couldn't get out into the wider global market, we would see a big global downturn, probably not that far off, if there were massive constraints in energy supply and oil. Secondly, you wouldn't see much development with regards to microprocessors and electronic equipment, probably for several years. And this is why the United States is engaged in something called the CHIPS Act, which is really trying to repatriate, reshore significant amounts of microprocessor manufacturing back onto the American mainland, but also to key allies. They're doing that because they feel there's a very real possibility that China will indeed invade Taiwan. So finally, it's very easy for us to speculate, oh, will they, won't they? Oh, no, they won't. Oh, yes, they will. When the United States is spending, I think, upwards of $100 billion on reshoring and friendshoring, as it's called, microprocessor manufacturing capacity, they probably have a decent impression that over the next 10, 20, 30 years, Chinese quote-unquote reunification is probable, to say the least.
I think people do think about China and Taiwan as if it's like Russia and Ukraine. And legally, it's very, very different, right? So barely any countries recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Even the United States doesn't, because the one China policy, the sort of ambiguity of it, as far as I understand it. So when the Republic of China, Taiwan is still officially called the Republic of China, when that was created by Chiang Kai-shek, the United Nations and the United States, sort of the international community, recognized the Republic of China, Taiwan, as the real China. And it was only in 1971 that they switched to recognizing, what we think of as the big China as China. And the one China policy is, I think both accepted it, and it's called strategic ambiguity, because both parties agree there's only one China, but the government in Taipei thinks it's them, and the government in Beijing thinks it's them. It's not a Russia-Ukraine. Obviously, Taiwan seems to have a pretty healthy democracy and, rising living standards, and it would be a shame for it to be invaded. I don't want it to be invaded.
The fact that the United States is preparing the ground for microprocessor production outside Taiwan, very sensible thing to do, by the way. I think that indicates there'll be lots of belligerent rhetoric on this, but I think this is a qualitatively different kind of conflict to what you see with Ukraine and Russia.
You'd have World War III if China wanted it, and then the Americans tried to stop it. And then, because if you had, fighting of the Chinese versus the American one-on-one, I mean, you are looking kind of at World War III.
Yeah, I think the Americans are aware of that in a way that, I think in Ukraine, things can slide into unforeseen places. I think lots of modeling, lots of predictions, lots of intelligent analysis has taken place on Taiwan. It's something that US foreign policy makers have thought about for a very long time, whereas the whole Russia thing seems much more volatile and chaotic.